All right, so now we're down to our third and final section for our first unit test, the progressive error. Now, I hit the gilt age to show you how bad things were in society, how things have gotten for the average person. Our outside looks great, America's booming, the economy's great, jobs everywhere, things are mass produced, more cheaper, everybody's spreading out. But in the end, it's pretty horrible. In the progressive error, this section where we're going to try to fix it. We're trying to make things for the better. Now, there's a lot in here we're going to skip over because we're seeing strictly what you need to know for the STAAR test. So I am doing disservice to people who are taking like the AP test or anything like that. There's a lot more depth to this, but we're going to skip through a lot just to knock out the STAAR test. So my students, their notes that they have, we've got this little section here. And then I actually tell them the main thing that you know is about overproduction. The other stuff's self-explanatory by the time you're in high school. You know what high cost means, things cost more money. Farmers in debt, they're in debt for a variety of reasons, but in general, it's you don't have to know those reasons, like they bought too much machinery and loans and things like that. You know what natural disasters are. Okay, the key here is that when you look at this, you see overproduction, you have to understand that if you're producing too much of one thing, the price drops. Basic supply and demand. The more you have of something, the less it's worth. So when more farmers have moved to the Great Plains from the Homestead Act from last section, more people are growing as fast as they can. I mean, they're tearing up the soil, they're ruining it because in 30 years you had the Dust Bowl in the same area, when you think about it. But they're planting as fast as they can, getting crops out, planting again, as much as they can. They're overproducing, and the price of wheat, for instance, is dropping dramatically. So whenever my students look at this, I'm like, hey, the other ones you're familiar with, you might not be familiar with agricultural overproduction and what it causes. So I always make sure students are aware of that before we move on. Because a lot of times you test with a whole table of prices. And I said, what are the cause of the drop in the prices above? And some students will put drought, because they're thinking, that's mine, they're thinking that there's a drought, so it makes sense. But you think about it, if there's a drought, there's less food, so the crop prices will actually go up, if anything. But overproduction explains exactly why prices drop. There's too much of it. So always make sure students are aware of that coming into it. I used to go into detail about the Grange movement and the Granger laws. For my students, I tell them to highlight the Interstate Commerce Act. We did this before in a previous section, but it's one of the few things when I look at students who struggle, it's one of the things they forget. They always remember to remember the Antitrust Act, but they never remember the Interstate Commerce Act. At this point in time in history, farmers have gotten together, and the Grange movement really started as a club to help each other out. At this point, they must have begun to realize that railroads were charging them differently, and they start organizing more into political units. They'll go to their local electives and get these laws pushed forward to higher ups. That eventually we see the first business law in U.S. history, that's the Interstate Commerce Act, to regulate railroads. It's important because it's the first time U.S. government's going to step in and regulate business. So two things I always tell students: interstate commerce, if you know what regulates railroad, and you understand it's the first law of its kind that allow the government to regulate business, you always get a question right as long as you understand that. But nonetheless, the Grange is pretty interesting. Now, these Granger laws, named from the Grange movement that they come from, this eventually is going to form essentially into a political party. We're going to call it the Populist Party in just a second. I do like this tapestry. This farmer is at the center, says, "I feed you all," reminding those that I sail for you all, the ships that fight for you all, the soldiers that carry for you all, the railroads, from the banks to everything. At the center is the farmers I feed for you all. And that was a big push they had when they're trying to get represented in Congress, essentially. And you gotta really think about this. These guys, if there's a few states of the Great Plains, there's not a lot of people, so you don't have a lot of members in the House of Representatives representing the states. You've got senators, but there's only 2 senators per state. They really need to get other people on board. And especially when you think about what's going on there in the Great Plains and these areas compared to the East. The East has those cities. You gotta get the cities on board with you. And you kind of see that emerge from the Populist Party. Now, you don't have to know the term Populist Party anymore for the STAAR test, but essentially the Populist Party platform, I always tell students, essentially this turns into the progressives. And the progressives get adopted by the Democrats, essentially. So I always tell students, hey, you see where populist, it's gonna help you if you just think progressive, because they turn essentially into progressive. Now, again, for us, I'm gonna make it short and sweet. Some boxes we're gonna cross out and not need, but the first one, unlimited coin of silver, that whole concept there was to make prices more affordable, or make money more widespread. And when you think about it, if your money's backed on gold, the concept here is that gold's worth more, so you have less money and printed, less money out there. Silver is worth less, so you're gonna have more money out there because there's more silver out there, so it's more silver printed. Now, it doesn't really work that great if you look at economics. This is 120 years ago, and this seemed to be the idea. The farmers had this idea that you make your paper based on silver instead of gold, and there's more of it in the money supply, and it can help out and make them help pay loans back easier. Farm prices would go up. They would benefit. And you think if you're a worker in the East, that sounds great too, because you would have more money too. Anybody poor could agree with this concept. You also have to know direct election of senators. I always tell my students write number 17 next to that, because that's the 17th Amendment. Our founding fathers did not trust us to elect our senators. Instead, what they did was have us elect our House of Representatives, and they would choose the senators. At this point in time, with corruption, political bosses, political machines, it wasn't uncommon for a senator to be able to buy their seat, give House of Representatives money from in some ways, campaign, or just flat out buy the seat, and you can become a senator. The Populist Party platform was to fix that. And progressives agreed with that whole concept and said, hey, we should directly elect our senators. This is the one of the houses in the legislative branch that makes laws. Why shouldn't we have direct election of them? But that took the 17th Amendment because it wasn't originally written that way in the Constitution. Term limits for president, I tell my kids to cross that off. Cross off secret ballots, both important to talk about, but not on a STAAR test. Term limits doesn't happen until 1953 when it goes into effect, essentially. Secret ballots are important, but that's not STAAR stuff. The government ownership of railroads, telegraphs, and telephones, I tell my students to cross that off. It's an interesting concept, and to get students to understand it, I always remind them, hey, you don't pay, imagine if you lived in a world where you had to pay the fire department $100 every month. And if you quit paying them and your house caught fire, they wouldn't come put it out. Same thing with police. If you didn't pay a monthly fee to the police, then they never came to your home, or they didn't answer your calls when it happened. Or schools, right? Imagine having to pay for schools, how few people would like that. The progressives looked at those things that the government did run and said, hey, maybe the government should be in charge of railroads, telegraphs, and telephones because they can make it more affordable, and we'll have less corruption because the government couldn't manage it all. But that never ceased to be, and that borders on line with what people call socialism, where the government owns more and more, has more and more control, essentially, of the economy. That never happens. The graduate income tax, I always tell students circle income tax, I write the number 16 next to it. It's a 16th Amendment. Today we're going to talk about 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment. There's 4 progressive amendments. And the 16th one is an income tax, 1% for the wealthy would not have to pay. And it makes sense if you're going to have these programs where you have health inspectors in the meatpacking industries, which we'll talk about later, but firemen, fire inspectors, you need schools now with more students. You got all this stuff. It's going to cost money. And one way you can do that is tax the ultra wealthy millionaire guys like Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. Maybe they should pay some taxes. But that's a debate even today. The last 2, I have my students cross off. Immigration restrictions with quotas. That is true. That's fact. This happened in the 1920s. And it wasn't for the farmers so much as it was for the workers back east. Remember, immigrants take the jobs, as they would say. Shorter workday, if that sounds like something we talked about the unions before, you're right. Again, the Populist Party, some of this was for farmers, some of it was to target workers to get them attracted to it. Now, the Populist Party, as it forms, it does do pretty well at first. For a third party in the first election in 1892, they got 5 senators and over 1 million people cast votes for the president. So the following election, the Democrats take note of that. And I always tell students there are 2 things third parties do wonderfully. Is you introduce new ideas, and that's what they did. The Populist Party had introduced these ideas, these concepts of silver, direct election for senators, all that stuff we previously talked about. The Populist Party introduces those ideas. And if the Democrats see that, hey, 1 million people voted for their guy for president, the Democrats can say, maybe if we adopt those ideas, we get more support. And so William James Bryant would do that. He'll give the Cross of Gold speech where he'll tell this pumped up crowd that we would not crucify America on a cross of gold. A metaphor, if you will. The gold does not sound like a good thing. It's what you get crucified on. And so the pro-silver people loved him so much for that. So supposedly they carried him out on their shoulders. I know it's hard to imagine a 2-hour political speech ending like that and people being excited, but things were different back then. Okay? McKinley is going to be the Republican president. You don't have to know him for the test. They've taken this whole thing off pretty much essentially about McKinley. But the Republicans, when they run, he has business support. And he has tons of money in his war chest for his campaign from businesses. And he's going to win out. And even in his re-election, he wins again because the economy is doing just fine. But there's a lot of things that do happen after that election to McKinley. He does get assassinated, and his VP will take over. I always argue that the VP got him elected, but that's just me because I love his VP, which is Teddy Roosevelt. But we'll get to him in just a second. When we talk about progressive movement, people fixing. Progressive, I always tell students, not like the car insurance company. Don't think that. I want you to think of a progressive, somebody trying to fix problems. In modern times, we look at guys like Bernie Sanders. He calls himself a progressive. He sees healthcare as an issue and we need to fix it. Whether you agree or disagree with his methodology or his ideas, and that's fair, that's up for debate. He does see it's a problem that needs to be fixed. Same thing with income inequality. He thinks, hey, minimum wage is not right, we gotta fix something along those levels. Whether you agree with the policies, nonetheless, you can easily argue he wants to fix the problems of society. And that's what progressives do back then and now. 120 years ago, some of these progressives were actually women. I always make this a point for my students. I always show a picture of Carrie Nation. And I don't have to know her for the STAAR test, but if you see her with her Bible in hand and hatchet in the other hand, and you remember the stories of her, it might help you understand a lot of questions on a STAAR test. Carrie Nation, she would go to bars and she would take her hatchet and she would just chop up and destroy liquor bottles. And now a lot of times she'd get arrested and she'd be released. Most of the time it's because she did this in dry counties where alcohol was illegal. So the question remains, the bar is not supposed to be there anyways. So what are you going to charge her with? Destruction of something that was illegal to be there in the first place? But nonetheless, she did this actually quite a bit. She came in and busted up bottles and was arrested custody for doing that. And she's pretty far out there. If you look at that picture, you can see that. And I do that for my students. Remember one thing. The temperance movement was woman-supported, heavily woman-supported. That will lead to prohibition, which is our 18th Amendment. That's to ban alcohol, prohibit alcohol, sale and use of alcohol. That was prohibition. But it starts with the women and temperance movement. And so you'll see this sometimes answered or asked on the STAAR test different ways is the roots of prohibition, where can it refer to, and it's women, or say the temperance movement would be an answer choice, but nonetheless women are part of the temperance movement. Now it's not just women, to be honest. Christians at this time, 120 years Christians felt that when they saw bad things happening, if they didn't do anything about it, they're just as bad as the sinners. They had to stop human suffering. They should help. That's a Christian thing to do. And so they'll get involved in this as well. So it becomes a really big thing. You can see from some of these propaganda, I would argue. My father keeps a tavern. My husband spends his money at a tavern. Which one would you want to be? This is a more famous one. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Even if you don't want to touch your lips, they still make it clear that men should stop drinking. And remember the reason for this. Progressives are supposed to make society better, fix the problems. And we can look at data, and data proves this. This is a fact. As industry rises, so does consumption of alcohol. Men go from working on the farms nonstop, day morning to day night, and then exhausted, sleeping, then waking up. That was typical. But once you have industry factories, you work a 7 to 7 job and you're done. You have a few hours to kill off steam, and so you drink. So alcohol consumption goes up. So industry goes up, alcohol consumption goes up, crime goes up. Domestic violence is one of the worst things that go up clearly with the rise of alcohol. So you get rid of alcohol, fix the problem. One of my favorite cartoons at times is this one. It's called The Drunkard Progress. He starts off as one drink with a friend. Then you have a drink to keep the cold out, maybe a shot of whiskey. Glass too much, you guys feeling pretty good, right? Now you're drunk, have a good time. You reach the summit at the very top where you're jolly companions and a confirmed drunkard, living the life. Shortly after that, you spend your money, that leads to poverty and disease. Your friends forsake you because you're drunk. Then you turn to crime and desperation. And then, whoop, this one's a real bad one, but I can't even mention that on YouTube because it could get blocked. But nonetheless, you can see the result. It's kind of a, it's a slippery slope, right? It's like, oh, if one thing happens, it's going to end that. It's literally titled From the First Glass to the Grave. And of course, you've got the widow suffering and the children. Always add children when you pull heartstrings. Always think of the kids. But nonetheless, it's propaganda, or it's an explanation why alcohol should be illegal. And so women were behind this temperance movement. which leads to essentially the prohibition of the 1920s, which we'll get to, and that is the 18th Amendment. So another progressive amendment trying to fix society. Part of this progressive era are these guys who expose society for what it is. And we talked about one already, a guy named Jacob Riis that took the photographs, if you remember, of tenements. Now, this guy, particularly Upton Sinclair, is going to write a book called The Jungle. And it exposes the meatpacking industry, how bad it really was. Originally, he wrote this to show you how tough the job was, but reading this, you're gonna walk away not thinking about how tough the job is, but how miserable and gross it is. The meat is one excerpt. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat, even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. There was no place for the man to wash their hands before they ate dinner, and so they made a perfect practice of washing them in the water that was to be ladled into the sausage. You hear stories about how meat is just thrown on the floor, rats scurry across it, they poop on it. If you cut your finger, bleed all over the meat, it doesn't matter. You lose your finger, it doesn't matter. Shovel that stuff up. It's kept at room temperature, it's not cold at all. All this stuff, remember there's no government regulations. He writes The Jungle, and it shows how horrible the meatpacking industry is. And so when we talk about these guys who rake up all the muck and crap of the time period so everybody can see it clearly, they'll call them muckrakers, or muckrakers, depends who you ask. Jacob Riis did that, right, with the photographs. So I always tell students, Jacob Riis is asked on STAAR test, so circle that one. Upton Sinclair is circled, and I always say, make sure you know Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, because sometimes they give an excerpt, and at the bottom it says The Jungle, and if you just know what that book is, you'll be able to answer the question. It helps out a lot. But Upton Sinclair is another one you have to know. These other three you don't have to know, but they're interesting. Ida Tarbell, she was one exposed and wrote about Rockefeller and his business tactics. That would help lead to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Lincoln Steffens wrote about corruption in the city, political machines and whatnot. Frank Norris wrote a novel about a farming family who had problems with the railroads, and so it's based on like fact, but it was a fiction novel, but it exposed that. These three you can actually cross out. They're not on STAAR test, but these all are muckrakers, essentially. But the only two are often asked on STAAR test. So if you go over here, look at this side, you can see the little cartoon raking up all the muck and shining a light on it. Muckrakers are doing that. Over here, you see the meat scandal and a rake that says investigation. And if you look who this could possibly be, my students first noticed the White House in the background. And this guy's wearing stripes for pants, so it's more likely a president. On the right, it's Theodore Roosevelt. He'll be the first progressive president, and we'll talk more about him and the meatpacking industry in just a second. But again, muckrakers who we're talking about. Now here, there's a couple things we can talk about. These aren't muckrakers, but they're important people of the time. Jane Addams is a social reformer, means she's trying to change society. And what she's discovered is, while in London, she sees these settlement houses. And I have definition here, community center for poor. It's really targeted for immigrants who came to America and they need help settling in. And there's these local community centers, essentially, where you can learn English, sometimes during the day, sometimes at nighttime, where they provide childcare, because if you're both parents of immigrants and they're working, who takes care of the kids? And then nursing services as well. All these little areas in these big cities are called settlement houses. Jane Addams ran the biggest and largest one in America in New York City called the Hull House. That's what she's known for. So she's a social reformer. She's trying to fix things for what it is. Ida B. Wells, make sure you know her. So on here, I always want students to circle Jane Addams. Make sure you know her for creating settlement houses in America, and the most famous one, the Hull House. Ida B. Wells, circle her name, underline anti-lynching, and she pushed for anti-lynching bill. Now, it's hard to explain this to students, but at this point in time, after Reconstruction, the South is a pretty horrible place for a black person to live. Almost immediately, Jim Crow laws were put in place where blacks couldn't, it wasn't just like they couldn't drink water from same water fountain, or they had to wait in separate lobbies, or couldn't ride buses, or something like that. It wasn't just that. It was literally like your life was in danger constantly. You could be accused of something and you didn't get a trial. And if you did get a trial, it wasn't a fair trial by far. It wasn't even a trial of your peers. It was people that knew nothing like you putting you on for a trial. So it's pretty interesting when you look at it. And in the South, lynching was a serious issue. If you're accused of crime, sometimes you weren't accused of a crime, people just thought you were a bad person or thought you did something. A group of men would show up, sometimes in mask, sometimes not in mask. A group of white men would take the black man and they would beat him, torture him different ways, and then hang him from a tree. And then they would take pictures sometimes and send these as postcards throughout the North. So when the North tries to pretend they didn't know, that's not true. They did know that. I think the best example I have is the movie The Butler. At one point, there's a reference when the butler tells his wife, "Oh, that just happens in the South, just in the South." So it seems to be a geographic thing, but they did know about it. The North didn't know what was going on in the South, whether they do it or not. Now, lynching is a horrific concept and idea. Students don't grasp the full how bad it really is because we often are scared to talk about it, but it's something we have to talk about. It's something we need to describe. And it's happened frequently. And so my students were like, "Oh, well, you shouldn't be committing a crime, but it wouldn't happen." These people weren't found guilty, they were just accused of it. And they weren't accused for a good reason. Because that's always the other thing we hear. It's like, "Oh, well, I'm sure they got accused for a reason. It probably has something to do with it." I remember one case in Alabama, this man was accused of a crime, and mob showed up to lynch him, and his friend was there, and they lynched him too, just for being there. And so after they lynched him, his friend, they lynched his friend. After that happens, his friend's wife goes to the police, and she knows who did it. And the police are like, "Sorry, I can't help you." She knows, she tells them who did it. It's people at the police station, it's the local people. They do this. Where she's upset, she's willing to go to the papers about this. She goes to the papers, and then she is lynched. Essentially what they do to her, she's 9 months pregnant, they hold her upside, they tie her upside down, they cut her stomach open. As a baby falls to the floor, they stomp it to death as she dies watching this. And it should be eye-opener. And if this makes kids uncomfortable, students, it should make you uncomfortable because it's a horrific thing. If you don't have feelings for this, then I would argue you're a robot. It's a pretty horrible thing. But I feel it's necessary for us to discuss how bad this got so people understand the frustration that Black people have to the point where they're willing to march just for the right to vote. And then you can understand like 100 years, 120 years later, when you see these movements now, like some people are just like, "Why are Black people so angry?" If you don't fight to end this, it gets pretty bad, as we've seen recently. So this is part of U.S. history. It's something we can't ignore. It's nothing to be proud of, but just because you're not proud of it doesn't mean you should ignore it, pretend it never happened. You should talk about it so it never happens again. But Ida B. Wells, anti-lynching. We see something similar to this. I always compare this to hate crime. A few years ago, locally close to here to Baytown, there was an older Black man was dragged to his death by 3 white supremacists. And it helped really spur the idea of hate crimes, meaning if you kill or murder somebody or commit a crime based on the hatred of religion, ethnicity, skin color, race, or anything like that, essentially your charge, the punishment is higher than just on normal. So I always compare the anti-lynching, her crusade to end anti-lynching and get an anti-lynching bill passed, similar to hate crime, those bills being passed too. It is slightly different, don't get me wrong, but nonetheless, it's pretty interesting. Ida B. Wells, important that you know her for the STAAR test. She's been asked about a few times. Now we're talking about this idea of rights and equality, especially with Black people. We're talking about civil rights, and typically it's like civil rights, you think MLK, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and a lot of local people as well, local level. But you think about the 60s. But I always point to students at the turn of the century, 1900, were 2 very important characters who were trying to push for civil rights. But they were doing 2 completely different ways and 2 different ideologies. And it may have hurt the movement, is a fair argument to say. But you got W.B. Du Bois. I always tell students, circle him, online NAACP. He's going to be a very educated man, incredibly intelligent. Went to college. I believe it was Ivy League school, if I'm correct. And he wasn't born into slavery. He was born after slavery. And he has this approach that says we should demand equality now, fight for equality, boycott, strikes, whatever you got to do, demand equality now, no compromising. His mind, compromising is giving up. Because it's a good point. If you compromise, the movement loses aid or help. Because if you compromise and half the people get what they want, then they're not helping anymore. And so compromise is a horrible thing to him. He'll help create the NAACP, since our National Association for Advancement of Colored People still exists to this very day. They do everything from scholarships to legal representation. And he's known for founding that. Now, his opposite is Booker T. Washington, who looks at it and says, whoa, we can't rush this. He, keep in mind, was born into slavery. He thinks Black people should be thankful they don't have it anymore. And slowly, they can turn the minds of whites. He's thinking that, hey, let's prove ourselves in the economy. Once we prove ourselves and people have to work with us, and we make ourselves essential to the economy, part of the economy, eventually they'll slowly treat us better. And compromise means a step in the right direction. That's his viewpoint. He does this. He goes to Tuskegee, Alabama, and creates a Tuskegee Institute where he's going to have it's bricklaying, bricklaying as part of the community. Always ask students which one they know more about, which one have they heard before. And Booker T. Washington's often, I always hear about schools being named Booker T. Washington for that, so I feel like he wins out as a more popular one. But W.B. Du Bois is often forgotten in history for the large term, but he was an incredibly touched man that deserves some recognition. And so my test and STAAR test, they always ask about one of them or both of them in one question, always. So that's a very common question to see on the test. But civil rights leaders go back that far, to the 1900s. Now, I include them with the progressive because they're trying to make society better, and that's why we always include them here at the turn of the century. Now, real quick, there's a few things on here. I always tell my students cross off A. We'll talk about these guys in depth more. Teddy Roosevelt as president more than anything else. But I tell them cross off secret ballot. We already talked about that. I have here the direct election of senators. Again, remind you, senators 7, senators 17, 17th Amendment for senators. Direct party primaries, you can cross that off. That's not asked on STAAR test. But it's interesting at this point in time, progressives really push for this idea that we all should choose the guy leading our party, not some backroom decisions by wealthy people. We all should choose. So primaries are a new thing at that time too. These next three are interesting enough. I always tell my kids to understand initiative better, write the word petition. And this isn't exactly how this is the best way to explain it in the time frame. But imagine if you as a voter, you wanted to get a law passed, and the only way you can do it is you vote for a person, and that person hopefully does what he's supposed to do and get everybody else to vote for a law. It's very difficult. But if you have enough people to sign on a petition, and you bring this to the attention of locals, they could put it on the ballot. And so if you go to like November 2024, you go to vote for president, you'll have the very top president of the United States, senator, House of Representatives, state senators, state House of Representatives, county clerks, all that stuff goes on and on and on. And after that, to the very bottom, you have, do you agree with Proposition 281? And it could be something like legalizing marijuana. You will finally get to vote directly on law, see if it becomes a law, yes or no. That is referendum. So I always say put petition above initiative, the referendum, where you could vote on the ballot, vote for the bill on ballot. I always tell students to write, vote directly on law, and because this is a form of direct democracy, you're voting directly on law. Typically we don't have this in America. The Constitution gives us a representative democracy, where we vote for a representative who votes on laws, but not this. This gives you people the power to vote on the law. And furthermore, the third part of this is recall. I tell students to think of impeachments, but for local levels. Because impeaching really is reserved to just for the president, and that's in the Constitution. But what about the local county judge? What about the governor? If they're trash, there's no way to get rid of them. The introduction of recall, which is impeaching or removing them from office, is born. Now, so I always tell my kids to write impeach above it, and they understand it's impeaching other people besides just the president. These two things, when they ask for a STAAR test, I swear I've never seen it, and maybe once or twice, maybe. But they rarely ask exactly what they mean. It's actually more important, the theme. All three of these will give more power to the people. Power is taken a little away from the government, and more power is given to the people. That's a theme from all these in the progressive period. Power is the people have more so than ever before, and have more say-so in government with that power. So that's important to understand too. I'm going to skip over this really fast. You don't have to know for a STAAR test. It's pretty interesting when we look about it. But this goes back to Andrew Jackson's time. Teddy Roosevelt, let's take a look at this photo. You'll see Teddy Roosevelt. He's president. He's a progressive president. You can see how he treats the trust. The bad monopolies, he takes out. The good monopolies, he restrains, he controls. Now you can argue the legality of that. You know, you treat one, they all have to apply. Sherman Antitrust Act has to apply to everybody. And that's a fair argument. But Teddy Roosevelt is going to be very picky and choosy about the trust that he's going to break up, you know. There's a coal miner strike. So I should say miner strike here. And typically the government, when they do step in, we always talked about this before, when there's strikes, they're violent and the government always has the business. But Teddy Roosevelt's getting worried because these coal miners are on strike. They refuse to work. The owners refuse to negotiate. Winter's coming up. It's going to be cold. People need coal in the northern states. So Teddy Roosevelt calls both of them to the White House to try to fix this. And at one point, supposedly, he said he made a threat to throw the owners off the balcony on the White House because they refused to negotiate. Later on, I read that it was he said in an interview that he felt like throwing them off, but he never threatened to throw them off. Regardless of it, even he has difficult problems trying to negotiate for these. He eventually will get a commission going and get third parties to decide how to solve everything and get it done. But it's interesting because we've always seen the government come in and just destroy and hammer and break apart strikes with violence. Teddy Roosevelt wants to end the strike for the good of the American people, but he does it in the most sophisticated and safest way and tries to negotiate difference. But he's not as a trust buster because he's breaks up those trusts quite often. What's actually really important to know from Teddy Roosevelt, though, is the Pure Food and Drug Act, what we now know as FDA. So I always want to circle that. Number one is self-explanatory. If you know what the Meat Inspection Act is, I'm sorry. I can't really help you, but it's an act to help inspect meat. It leads to the food and drug, which means it means that the government will set regulations for the food and drug industries, meaning that the meat has to be kept at certain temperatures, it has to be wrapped at all times. Even when you cook it, it has to reach a certain temperature degree. You must have a sign that says employees wash hands in the restroom. All kinds of rules and regulations are born with the FDA. And that's Teddy Roosevelt. It turns out he read The Jungle, so disgusted by it, he sent two guys to start doing reports about this packing industry. And when they said, "Ned's that bad," he convinced Congress to pass a law. He signed it almost immediately. We have conservation, not conservative as in political movements, but conservation is I want to conserve Mother Nature. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the first big guys to do that. Now, a perfect example is one year they had a picture of him with John Muir, and he's an environmentalist that invited Teddy Roosevelt out to California. And there's all these giant redwood trees in California, like the big ones where they actually have a hole where you drive a car through. And it's all about to get taken down, destroyed by lumber companies. And Teddy Roosevelt shows up and he sees how magnificent this area is. He says, "No, we can't let this happen. The government's going to purchase this land." And the government, under Teddy Roosevelt, will purchase land in certain areas to make sure it's not used for lumber, oil, or taken over or anything. It's bought by the government and protected by the government. Later on, these turn into national parks. So technically, Teddy Roosevelt doesn't create the national park system, but he really starts to set up and he says, "Hey, we need to take care of this land for future generations to see the beauty of it." So the idea of conservation really does start with Teddy. National Park Service comes just a few years later. Teddy does a lot during his time as president. On his way out, he became president by accident. He wasn't supposed to be president. McKinley was shot, and the VP was Roosevelt. And the only reason he was VP is because the Republican Party was scared how powerful he was getting and how much people loved Roosevelt. And so they put him as VP kind of like for him to die off. Like once he was VP and served a couple of terms, people would forget about him and be over him and he'll be done. So the Republican Party, when they picked him VP, they had no clue they were picking a guy that would really become president because McKinley is shot and killed. So Teddy Roosevelt finishes McKinley's first term, then does his own term, and he says, "All right, I'm done. I'm heading to Africa for a 2-year safari. It's my retirement." And he picks a guy named William Taft to take over for him. Now, Taft is known as the fattest president alive, got stuck in a bathtub. There's a whole bunch of stories about Taft. But Teddy Roosevelt leaves it behind, and when he comes back after 2 years safari in West Africa, or in Africa safari, Teddy Roosevelt's furious about what he sees. Turns out, Taft has sold land, he's done everything Teddy hated, he's furious with Taft. And Teddy goes, "All right, that's it, I'm running for president, I'm coming back." And the Republican Party says, "Not with us." The Republican Party decides they're gonna stick with Taft. They don't like Teddy, he's uncontrollable, he does what he thinks is right and wrong, not what the party wants him to do. So Republicans don't like Teddy Roosevelt, they're gonna stick with Taft. Teddy Roosevelt looks at Democrats, not one of those guys. So we got Republicans and Taft. The Democrats put a guy up named Wilson. Teddy's kind of like, "I don't know what to do, guess I'll run as an independent. I'll just run as an independent, be the first independent president if I have to." And then later on, he'll get a nickname as Bull Moose Party. So you've seen Bull Moose like this. And that's because what Teddy Roosevelt does, he's shot actually on the campaign trail. He's giving a speech, he's shot in his chest, but he gets up, he stands at the podium and says, "I don't know if you know this, but I've been shot." Kind of hard not to notice, okay? But it takes more than a bullet to kill a bull moose. And he pulls out his 2-hour speech and he gives it. Now, just so you understand, what slows down the bullet, one thing is his speech is rolled up and it slowed down the bullets. And it's also very small bullets. Like, I don't know if you can still buy this size caliber. It's so small, I don't even know if you can buy them anymore. But it does pierce the skin. It does bleed, but not bad enough where he actually has to go to the hospital right away. When he does go to the hospital afterwards, they actually would tell him, hey, you seem to be doing okay. We're gonna leave that bullet in there for the rest of your life, and you'll be fine. Now, I say this because you think, oh, Teddy Roosevelt, man, independent, great guy, he has to get elected, right? No, he doesn't. It's proof that we're scared to vote third party. If I hate candidate A, candidate B, and the third party's in the middle, I still hate one more than the other one. And I don't want to throw my vote behind here if that means this person might make it. I hate it so much. So people are just too scared to vote third party. So even in times of Teddy Roosevelt, one of the greatest presidents, one of the coolest presidents, I mean, let me show you a picture of Teddy Roosevelt. If this doesn't get you elected right here, I don't know what will. It's false, it's fake. But it's one of the coolest memes I ever saw. Like when I first saw it years ago, I had to look it up to see if it was real. It's not, unfortunately, it's photoshopped. In the early days of Photoshop before AI, we can actually see the difference. But even if he did ride the back of a bull moose, he still wouldn't have got elected. Even if that was true, Teddy Roosevelt couldn't do it. And instead, we have the election of Democrats, Woodrow Wilson. And it makes sense because as Taft is Republican, Teddy comes in, he steals some Republican votes. Third parties can mess up elections. Two things they do, introduce ideas and mess up elections. He steals some of Taft's votes, so he doesn't get enough. Teddy clearly doesn't get enough, but the Dems get a little bit more, and Wilson becomes a president. And now it makes sense why he did become, because he does some pretty progressive stuff right away. He's the one that actually gets the income tax, which you're already talking about. Leave it up there if you're afraid you're gonna forget it. Amendment number 16. He creates a National Park Service. He's like, hey, Teddy was right about that stuff. Let's turn those into national parks, right? And he also creates a Federal Reserve Act. Now, the Federal Reserve is not often asked on STAAR tests. I can't remember if it ever has been, to be honest. If it has been, it's been once. And as part of that, I think it's really because it's unclear what you teach about. I explained them really quickly, briefly for your own education, but exactly what they ask about, it could vary greatly. But imagine the United States divided into 7 different zones, and there's a Federal Reserve Bank in control of each zone, and all those banks answer to the Federal Reserve Board on top of the whole country. And say inflation is out of control, like it was a couple years ago. Inflation hit 6%. All Americans expected a recession. The banks all over the country, or the world, in Europe, they were predicting an 80% chance of recession by the end of the year. Inflation had gotten up to 6%, it was growing fast. The Federal Reserve, they step in. The Federal Reserve's job is to regulate the money supply. And they do this in several ways. One big way they do this is they're the ones, the Federal Reserve Board gives the Federal Reserve Banks loans, and the Federal Reserve Bank loans are the ones that give Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citibank, all those banks. The Federal Reserve gives money to those banks, and those banks give you a loan. Now the Federal Reserve says, okay, we're gonna raise interest rates up to 2%, raise them up 1%. If they raise interest rates, the banks you go to have to raise their interest rates too, because they're borrowing the money from the Federal Reserve. And if they raise interest rates, Americans aren't gonna rush out and get home loans. They're not gonna get car loans. Interest rates are too high, you don't want loans, so you stop spending money and inflation goes down. And it happened. Past 2 years, inflation's gone from 6% to, less than 2 years, it's gone from 6% to 3%. And most people did not expect this to actually work. I was one of them. There's no way it's gonna work. We have to hit a recession, but it appears that we've actually steered clear of that. Even the biggest doubters and banks from Europe say now we don't have a 20% chance of a recession. It seems very unlikely. So the Federal Reserve came through this time. And the reason why people were so shocked is because it's messed up before, but it seemed to have worked this time. And the Federal Reserve goes all the way back to 1920s. That's why if you get a dollar bill from before 1920, it's a little bit different. Let me show you a picture. I think I have them up right here. So a dollar bill from before 1920 says silver certificate versus one after 1920 that says Federal Reserve note. Now you know why it says Federal Reserve note, because it's based on the Federal Reserve, which is kind of a hot topic when we talk about is your money really worth anything, yes or no. But that's another story for another time period. But I always tell students if they ever see anything on the STAAR test about banks, Federal Reserve, I understand Wilson was behind that. It's a progressive idea to fix the money supply so you can actually control it so people don't suffer. Also tell me if you see anything about national parks, wilderness, conserving it, it's a National Park Service. It's either gonna be Teddy or Wilson. They'll never give you both those choices because it's too close. It's just trying to trick you to do that. My last slide, stay with me. This is pretty straightforward. Women will eventually get the 19th Amendment and that's women's suffrage. And that does not mean women have to suffer more. It means they have the right to vote. Many states have given them the right to vote for a while, but it takes an amendment to guarantee it for all states. If you want the federal government to force a state to do something, you gotta get a federal government an amendment. If it's not already in the Constitution, right? And so that's the 19th Amendment with women's suffrage. Make sure you know that. One of the big ones behind this is Susan B. Anthony. I talked about this before in the last semester, how they met at Seneca Falls, and they made this agreement. This was their goal, women's suffrage, and she's going to be behind that. I will say in U.S. history, in Texas here, those are the big ones we talk about. We don't talk about people like Alice Paul, who was like when women went through an incredible amount of pain and suffering to get this, and it's pretty amazing when you look into it. Back then, women, if I had decided I wanted to divorce my wife, I could drop her off at a mental institute and say she's crazy, I want a divorce from her, y'all take her. And if I had the money to put her in the institute, they took her. Abraham Lincoln's widow, she was put in the mental hospital by her own son, and she had to contact her sister to get her out. So women have it really bad. So if women protested back then and did anything loud and crazy, they got thrown in a mental hospital. That was it. So you see these, or hear about these women who just wore all white in solidarity to show that they wanted the right to vote, and they carried on signs like this quietly. They stood there, they didn't get loud, they didn't go crazy, because they could have got thrown in a mental hospital, which did happen to Alice Paul. She had seen it done in England and did it here. She was thrown in a mental hospital. At one point, she went on a hunger strike and had to force feed her. It's pretty interesting when you look at her life, what she went through to get it done. So this whole joke about women voting and how it's last. After the Civil War, black men had the right to vote. All men had the right to vote, but not women. So it took a while to get it, and it was a lot of trouble. I do have this video in here for entertainment purposes. If you Google Lady Gaga remix, women's rights or anything like that, you can find it pretty easy on YouTube. It's well done video, but it takes Lady Gaga format and applies the women's suffrage to it, and it's pretty good. I do recommend that if you haven't got a chance to watch it. And that's going to do it for the progressive era. There are plenty of questions at the end of my PowerPoints for my students watching to actually go over and do practice. Again, on each one of these, there's numbers, and those are actually references to the questions at the bottom of the PowerPoint. Post this ASAP so you guys can master that test.